So I'll just make an opening comment, as I'm wont to do. I remember at the beginning of this book, we had a discussion about whether, oh, thank you, Jackson, whether he was just being, Bataille was being descriptive, or whether he was going to actually make any recommendations, because it seemed like he might have just been saying, well, this is the way the universe works. The general economy is just a natural principle that works its way into human activity. And when we go against it, bad things happen. But there's really, it's an explanatory framework. There's not really anything to do. But it seems pretty clear at the end of this last section, he seems to have a prescription. So anyway, I just, I could ask other questions, but I just thought that was interesting. He seems to be pretty clear, and Eric said at the beginning that he thought it was probably going to go that way, that he was going to say, here are some consequences of sort of ignoring the general economy. You end up with war, for example, and that he might offer some recommendations as to how to channel our energies elsewhere to avoid that outcome. And that, although another thing, it's not, it seems a little bit ambiguous at the end, but it seems like he still maybe thinks some kind of war is inevitable, whether it be military or economic or something. But anyway, I'll stop there.
Well, continuing off of what Nevitt said, I was kind of confused in this last reading about where we are today after the Marshall Plan's been implemented, because he makes the point that we're past the point of usual nation expenditure, right? Which was often for these big wars. War still happens, but Bataille claims that these wars profit only the rich, right? And I think that's an interesting remark. And perhaps I could do some analysis with some recent wars and connect the Bataille dots there. But where exactly are we in terms of expenditure? That's my question that I don't think I clearly got from Bataille. It's this weird situation, it seems.
I don't have an answer. One thing is there's a historical issue that, he's not been around for however long, but I have the same question.
Well, I've heard reports recently that a lot of our supply of Stinger missiles, and what's the other one? Stingers are for surface to surface, and then there's Hellfire missiles, the surface to air missiles. The U.S. is going to have to restock its supply because it's given so many to the Ukraine. So there's some expenditure there, right? I mean, each one of those is, I don't know what the price tag on each missile is, right? But they get sent over there and they either get used and blown up or they get captured, right? But again, board members of Raytheon and Boeing, they're making bank.
Ed, or maybe some of you other guys know, I feel stupid again in revealing my ignorance, but the Marshall Plan. So what was the fate of the Marshall Plan? Are there vestiges of it still around?
In a way, the thing that threw me off about his discussion in this last part is that all the books I have read that reference the Marshall Plan say that the United States, when the Marshall Plan was finally finished, gave, I'm trying to remember, around 16 European countries a total of $17 billion, not $5 billion. And I know Germany, who was a later recipient of the Marshall Plan, actually created a fund, and I'm not sure exactly if it was from the profits or whatever, but they actually created a fund that's called something like the Marshall Fund that in its origins had something to do with the money that the Marshall Plan gave to Germany. You will find economists today saying it wasn't that important. They'll get out their economics equations and say, well, Europe was going to have to grow a certain amount because it was at such a low level. But to me, that's always the weakness of pure economic explanation, because optimism or hope or a sense of this isn't going to work, right? I mean, how people view the world does have an effect. I mean, if people decide that bad times are going to continue, bad times are going to continue, will be a self-fulfilling prophecy, because they won't buy things, and you'll have flat demand in any country's economy. So I mean, the Marshall Plan, I'm trying to remember, the last year might have been 1955, but I could be wrong on that. But it was a year in the 1950s that technically the Marshall Plan money finally was all expended. But an interesting thing, did you catch this in his description analysis of it, which was spot on? And that was, it wasn't just saying to the countries, show us your economic plans and we'll dole out money to you. You have to cooperate. You have to show us how you're going to, he didn't use the word integrate, but that's what he was talking about. You're going to have to show us how you're going to integrate your economies with other European economies, because we're not going to create autarkic economies that are going to be competitive with each other and having World War III, right? So France, you have to buy stuff from Germany. Germany, you have to buy some from France, Netherlands, Denmark, the whole schmear. And I thought that was insightful from him, that he caught that, because my sense is, I mean, I know the book was published much later, but just the way he's writing it, sometimes it seems like he finished writing it 10 years before it was published or something.
(1967), if I'm reading the publication information correctly.
Did that answer your question, Evan?
Yeah. And so I guess, I'm thinking in terms of the things Bataille's interested in. It seems like, that the US is always going to generate excess, and maybe more excess than anybody else, if I understand his argument. Frankly, there were some paragraphs toward the end of this where I had a hard time figuring out exactly what he was saying. But it seems like he would say we should be giving more money away, and spending less on the military. And, we do give money away in various projects around the world, but I don't have numbers. My suspicion is that those expenditures are far outweighed by military spending. So,
yeah,
my guess is that, that maybe, he might have wanted the sort of follow on to the Marshall Plan to be just a policy of providing aid around the world that would lift the standard of living of the world in general. And even though we give some, we haven't done that.
I remember he quotes from two French writers, and I think that their insights were very useful, because it seemed like, well, this was my sense of the end of the chapter. He seemed to be amending his main argument, which was specific economies of whatever polity he was analyzing, the Llamas or the Mexica or whatever, were looking, there was a dynamic within that polity, economic in nature, right? But this was different. This was actually a country saying, we could put this money into reinvesting it into our own economy and updating our productive capability, right? I mean, that is an option, was an option. But instead it was, no, we're granting this money to you. And it was a grant. They were not loans, to enhance the productive capability of European countries. And so I got a sense that he was saying, yeah, this is interesting. This is different. What's going on here? because of the nature of of where the expenditure was taking place was beyond the country that was generating that capital for that investment.
Yeah, he didn't, I don't recall him saying this explicitly, but now that you mentioned it, it seems like all those other examples were, I think, for the most part, relatively localized phenomena, even if they were like extended through Europe, like when he was talking about Calvinism and all that. But this last part with the USSR and Russia, that it does seem to be that he's moved it to a global stage, and maybe it's just because of the current economic situation of the world allows for, or not only allows for, but the current reality is that it is a global economy, and maybe he's just, without ever saying it explicitly, saying now these movements take place at this global scale, and so if we're going to address the possibility of building economic structures more consistently with the general economy, we've got to look at them on a global scale, perhaps. Maybe that's what he's thinking. And then you've got these two great opposing powers in his mind, the US and the USSR. And another interesting question is, given that the USSR collapsed, is there a similar structure now or not? Like, do we now have the West versus, I don't know, Russia and China? Is it a three-way thing? Or, now China and Russia are kind of sort of allied, but not really, in that, China's kind of on their side with regard to Ukraine, but it kind of not. So anyway, I kind of wondered if he updated this book for today's world, whether his analysis would still hold, and if so, what would the structure of the world look like?
Well, he says, if, as much as bad as parts of the Soviet Union are, that without it, the world would, become less stable, which doesn't seem to be all that contradicted by modern events, I mean, not just Russia, Ukraine, but there's, a lot of, that kind of stuff happening since the fall of the Soviet Union. So I think that part would at least hold up.
I would guess, and obviously this is pure speculation, but China today, and when I say today, I mean for the last 20 years roughly, has had such sustained growth rates since the late 1970s that by the early 2000s, it had such capital that even, like, I don't know if you've heard of the Belt and Road initiatives of China, has been basically, China a year or two ago just signed a deal with Sri Lanka to develop a port. China's going to use, under this contract, 70% of the port for 99 years. I thought the 99 years was a nice touch. It's like, yeah, we're getting back at you assholes for Hong Kong. But what's interesting to me, though, is that I think that China, even though it's doing all of these transportation, infrastructural, communication projects, it's to tie different parts of Asia and Africa, the Indian Ocean, to China. You know what I'm trying to say? It's linking all of these economies to the Chinese economy. So to me, China is basically following a neo-mercantilist kind of approach, in that it would fit very well with Bataille's sense of, the productivity of a specific economy and it having its own logic. So rather, China's not making these advances to say, Kenya, Uganda, you're going to be more self-sustaining. You're going to be building up your economy. It's rather, if you really look at these projects, it's how can we get resources from Africa to ports to be shipped to China. Right? It's very much linkages like that.
Yeah, and I've heard there China is buying up a lot of resources in Africa, bankrolling a bunch of businesses, and imposing pretty sticky loan requirements and so on, so that they're slowly sort of turning Africa into a in a sense a vassal state, but but using economic strong arm techniques.
I just literally saw this in yesterday's New York Times. China just signed a security agreement with the Solomon Islands that is really causing deep unease, not only for the people there, but for Australia, New Zealand, and the United States, because it's not just we're allies, it's very broadly stated. And this agreement says, well, if any kind of Chinese national or Chinese property or Chinese investment is threatened, or if there is a threat to order, then the leader of the Solomon Islands may request from China to send in troops to take care of the situation. And so people are saying, wait a second. I mean, look, you're our president, but that doesn't mean we want you for life, and you shouldn't be backed by the Chinese Navy.
Yeah, Australians are really upset about that.
Yeah.
So did you guys get the impression at the end that he thinks war of some kind is inevitable? I mean,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, very much so. I was curious about when to talk about it to make sure it's staying on topic, because I think what he's saying is that there's going to be some component of what it is to be human that's going to cause conflict. And he gives a big example of all of these historical examples of conflict and revolutions. And I don't think he's saying that these are necessarily bad things. These are just things that are parts of a concept of what the human condition is. It's the participation of what we do with that really is, I think, what he's offering as a solution, particularly in regards to the expenditure of all this. Because I don't, for me, and I'm just kind of thinking about this out loud, is that, we have this excess energy, this excess to die. There's always going to be this component of what it is to be in any part of this nature where we're trying to expel this excess energy that we have. So there's going to be a conqueror, there's going to be a victim, there's going to be some dynamic of that in any force. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's what we do with it, particularly the perspective that we have and the sacrifice component. Like, to me, the sacrifice component isn't so much just a direct action, it's also a participation in the community of intimacy. So he seems to lean strongly on intimate participation with lucidity, not just having an aspect of expending for expenditure's sake. And war seems to be part of that. We're going to fight. There's going to be a master and slave. There's going to be a revolution. There's going to be rebellions. It's just that when we start having this idea that there's something that we can create and maintain rather than constantly being in the creative process, it's just not going to be stable, because once we maintain it, it's essentially a sarcophagus at that point.
I want to say, Bataille holds out a utopian kind of vision without hope, without much hope, right? But like as a possibility, right? We're like with the last few paragraphs of the Accursed share, kind of, it puts the stress on self-consciousness, right? And an empty form of self-consciousness, and kind of gives the impression that with if mankind can enter a state of true self-consciousness, then we can manage our expenditure and we can avoid catastrophe. We don't necessarily have to have armed conflict. But I mean, the last two-sentence paragraph kind of says, you know, well, I mean, it says it seems like it might be going this way, especially because we just left off on the Marshall Plan, which is kind of an international from each according to his ability to, each according to his need, right? That Marshall Plan kind of moves in the right direction, but you know, he gives me the impression, right, that he kind of reads this as, but that was not a trend. That was a movement in the right direction, but that does not constitute a trend. If we were self-conscious as a race globally, we would do this kind of thing more often. And the last couple of sentences where he says, "Oh, but it's, you know, it may seem that way, but it's all just an illusion," I think is kind of hinting towards, you know, if we learn from the Marshall Plan and its benefits and did this kind of thing more often, we could enter a world where somewhere in the same section, he says something about, you know, the law of profit or the demand for profits is turned against itself, right? And so we no longer have these nations and competing economies with isolated interest competing against each other, because we've kind of turned it against it with a global view of a general economy attained through self-consciousness. We can do better, right? But like I said, the last two sentences kind of give you the idea that Bataille thinks that, you know, we're nowhere close. We're nowhere close to the self-consciousness required to actually take agency in history as such.
There are a couple of sentences on page 187. You know, in the middle, he says, "Disarmament under the present conditions is a propaganda theme. By no means is it a way out." And then at the end of the bottom of the page, "A disarmament is so far from being a possibility that one cannot even imagine the effect it would have. To suggest that this world be given a rest is fatuous in the extreme." And so the impression I got is that war, kind of like Eric was saying, war is not necessary. It's not a necessary consequence of the general economy, but so that it is at least theoretically possible that societies and nations could dispose of their expenditures in a way that would not produce war, but that given the current conditions in the world, the probability of that happening is vanishingly small. That's the kind of sense I got. Yeah.
I mean, I guess, but that leaves kind of a question in my mind. But I think Bataille tries to kind of address these worries that I have. I just want to kind of, I guess, think out loud. First off, I wanted to say, Nevitt, when you talked about this, like he doesn't say it explicitly, but it seems like there's this global economy kind of thing going on. I think that is that's hinted at, especially when, I mean, it's not like you said not said explicitly, but when he says the line about even in prison, the communists would continue to quote unquote, change the world. I think that is like a super, to me, it really seemed like a reference to the notion that like, even if they are cut off from the flow or whatever of trade, or sanctioned, embargoed, cut off by an iron curtain, in prison and whatever, or literally imprisoned, their presence will continue to change the world. And also I like that there were a couple of times where he would like predict the future kind of, and I would underline it in red every time. And I looked and I was like, pretty much every time he was right about what would happen. He was like, he wasn't trying to play the prediction game at all, I don't think, but he was, when he did, he was pretty good. And he was like, yeah, things would be much worse if the USSR wasn't around. But I think that point about them being in prison and changing the world is to say that their presence is changing the world, but it's not enough to maintain the stability or the dynamic sort of efforts at peace that were being motivated by the presence of the USSR. You know, because I think the Marshall Plan was an action that in a way, at the very least, kind of operates in this general interest thing that Francois Perrault is talking about, which is, again, in a way, kind of a baby step toward this dynamic peace thing. And it was instigated or motivated by an external power that threatened the very economic model that was being used. Now, here's the issue, is that I don't know to what degree a similar move is possible in the face of competing political powers against the United States today. You see what I'm saying? I just have two thoughts. First off, China, if we can point to China as maybe the last vestige of the communist dream of freedom or whatever, I know, right? Which would be like, that would be hard for me to do. I guess I could imagine potentially something like a Marshall Plan style response, or a set of particular responses in this competition with that Chinese model of economy, right? But because, like I said, because that is so hard for me to do, I don't think I'm going to assume that. Instead, I'm going to assume that China and America's economic models are not really in that dire of competition, and any sort of attempt at like a Marshall Plan thing by the United States might just, it won't have the zhuzh that it had when it was the Cold War. It won't have that oomph, because China, in a way, is, with this whole Belt and Road thing, I think, trying to kind of lay the foundations of economic, I don't know if I would call it warfare against the Western powers or foreign powers, but it just makes me think that the Marshall Plan worked because, or part of it worked in the way that it did because it was an attempt to keep things afloat for this system that was having to unify together to oppose this other system. In the contemporary sphere, there doesn't seem to be that same opposition. It seems like the Chinese economic model will be more than happy to service destitute or devastated nations or states in need of resources or military funding or infrastructure funding or whatever. I mean, with whatever symptoms of usury we might be able to detect or not, allegedly, I think that there isn't that same sort of opposition, which makes me fearful for the future in terms of any sort of capacity for this same sort of general, these moves like the Marshall Plan and the general interest. I'm fearful, I'm doubtful of their capacity to continue or to happen again. And what that further makes me think is what does this ending note, this notion of the U.S. tending toward something like the USSR and the politics of that, or the free enterprise being stressed, increasing the importance of the state. I mean, that kind of flows into that, like, there wouldn't be that much of a direct sort of necessary antagonism between the model of Asian capitalism, or capitalism with Asian characteristics, or Chinese capitalism, whatever you want to call it, and American capitalism. But the problem with that, right, is that then where does the USA stand? I mean, I'm not fearful for its fate. I personally have no, well, whatever. I'll leave that, my opinions aside. I am just curious, I guess. What is the plan here, I guess, even in this scenario that Bataille is kind of assuming, or at least preparing for, trying to prepare us for, what do we have to say about the sovereignty that's kind of implied, right? Because for these actions to occur, he says that there has to be one dominant economic structure that has a small portion of its excess that it can use because of this vast inequality. It can dump that into a foreign territory or state, which to them is a huge cash injection, but to the lender is no big deal. That was what he was trying to illustrate with the whole liquor thing, I thought. So we need that, and a couple of other determinations that I could list off. But my point is, are we? And he says a couple times, like, this isn't good. This is not a good set of circumstances. It's our last hope, and it's very hopeless and sad and pathetic that we're in the circumstances. But it's kind of all we got. Is he saying, at least in some sense, that a sovereignty, basically a universal sovereignty, is our primary hope? Or is it not a primary, or like a universal sovereignty, but like a, I don't know, some sort of progressive bifurcation of a sovereignty? Because I'm thinking about this tension that seems to be productive, this productive tension. What happens when that tension disappears? So do we need tension, or do we need some sovereign, or do we need illusory tension with some sovereign? Do you see the U.S. being the sovereign state that kind of rules the world? You see what I'm saying? That's my illustration. That's my point, I guess. Do you guys have any? I don't know. Does that make sense?
The way I would answer it, I thought Nevitt made a good point in the chat. It's the United States did things and felt it had to do things because of the Soviet Union's existence. I mean, how many times did you hear President Kennedy or President Johnson say, how can we not pass civil rights laws when we're saying we're a nation of freedom and justice and liberty for all people? And how is this looking when Black Americans can't go to a restaurant? You know, how can we argue on the world stage against what the Soviet Union is about? And that came up multiple times. And I think it was, and also, at least in principle, the communist system was based on, and you know, that one of you quoted his quotation, that's actually from Marx, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs, this sense of helping the people who aren't helped, you know, the people at the very bottom, the repressed and everything like that. And so, you know, it seemed to me that the gravest threat coming from the left internationally caused the United States to be more reformist, for lack of a better term. And when you look at the actions at the federal and even at the state level from 1945 to 91, I mean, look what's happened to the Republican Party since the fall of the Soviet Union. I don't like to use the term, it's become more conservative. Bullshit, it's become reactionary. Okay, the Republican Party doesn't want to undo Johnson's Great Society. It wants to undo Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. It literally wants to take us back to the Gilded Age. You know, no governmental regulation of the economy. Women and Blacks knew their place, begging your pardon, I'm saying that in a sarcastic way, you know, that is just, there was a way that certain things were done, and there was a hierarchy, and yes, we had this democratic little d, but that was really for the dominant group. And I am very much concerned, because this is very reactionary, very, very reactionary. And we've never had a political movement connected to one political party that I don't think that has ever been this reactionary in all of US history.
So would you say then, okay, that would be okay. Well, then that would be to locate us then, at least in some sense, we are feeling the effects of the fall of the competing model. Now we're feeling the effects of the fall of the competing model. But what that means, but I guess this is evidence to my point, that there doesn't seem to be something out there motivating populist reform as much as it might have been during the existence of the USSR. You know what I'm saying?
Well, I defer to all of you who have studied Nietzsche. I mean, I just have a passing acquaintance with him, but this is pure politics of resentment. You know, it's a shot through with, I'm not being heard, I'm being made fun of, my interests aren't being met, I am part of the flyover country, you know, you coastal elites, you know, and if you look at socioeconomic statistics, divorce, alcoholism, drug use, what's astounding is the Republicans, well, I hate to use the word Republican, people who are supporting more and more the Republican Party as it exists, pat themselves on the back to say, we're the real America. But if you look at socioeconomic data by county, the counties that regularly vote Republican have a higher divorce rate, higher alcoholism, lower literacy rate, lower levels of education, lower aggregate income. It is striking. And that's what also drives me insane, because it's like, people, you keep on voting for people who screw you economically with the policies that they implement, and they've been doing it since the early 1980s, and you keep on reelecting them. And then you blame the Democrats for living in shit. You know, it's not the Democrats who emaciated the federal regulatory agencies, who you know, kept on pushing tax cuts for the richest Americans and the major corporations. We have laws in place that say, of course, you get illness from the job, but they've been gutted because corporations will take someone to court and say, you can't prove you've got black lung because you worked in the coal mine. And so husbands are telling their wives, well, honey, when I die, make sure we've got enough money for an autopsy, so at least you can get some money when they open up my lungs and cut me open. I mean, it's a travesty. So, I mean, really, I mean, I agree with you, Hunter, that Bataille unnervingly hit some things that you think, I mean, you know, when were most of you born? I mean, Nevin and I are the ancients, but no one was saying, oh gosh, this is bad. You know, everyone was like, wow, you know, Germany got reunited. Berlin is one city. It was relatively painless, relatively bloodless. You know, it was, and then apartheid ended, relatively speaking. So it was like, wow, how did this happen? But we're not going to think about it too much. We're just happy it's over. And then for Bataille to say, wait a second, if the Soviet Union goes away, it's going to be very, very unstable, is right on target. And it just seemed to me that something got removed from political calculus in the United States, and you didn't have to worry about a global threat left of center. And now look at it. Putin and his government have very good, I don't want to say relationships, but they have ties to right-wing nationalist populist groups, not only in Europe, but the United States. In fact, there was an unemployed man in Bratislava in Slovakia, and he's been given millions of euros to right-wing parties in Europe, and his relatives are saying he's unemployed, he lives with his parents. He doesn't have that kind of money. And finally, he's just been charged being an agent of a foreign government of Russia. So, I mean, think. Did you ever think about this? The first couple of days of the invasion, a former president of the United States says about a Russian leader invading a country, oh, he's brilliant. Could you imagine Eisenhower in 1968 calling Brezhnev brilliant when the Warsaw Pact invaded Czechoslovakia? Inconceivable. And it's not just Eisenhower, any ex-living president. Truman wouldn't have said brilliant, right? But Trump did. Now, finally, that's peeled off some people from him, but I've got people who I know who are in the military. They're going to vote for Trump in 2024. And I said, you do know that he has said if he's back in office, he's going to remove the United States from NATO. And then there's this very long silence and they won't engage. And these are people who were in the Marines for 20 years, Army 20 years. They won't engage. It's almost like a, well, yeah, but. And this is a completely different issue, even though it's Bataille-ish. My sense about his sense of the future of the world, I got a sense, this is my interpretation, that he was torn. He thought there was a certain logic of production, right? And of the way economies work. But I thought he also was sometimes saying, well, yes, nuclear weapons do exist, and reasonably rational people will recognize that this is a difference in kind, not degree, in destructive capability in our planet. And so it was almost as if the sheer weight of nuclear weapons was going to counteract the impulse of economic activity and somehow channel it in a way that it wouldn't lead to a global explosion, literal global explosion.
Well, okay, yes, so then, the flow of resources or wealth have followed the logic that they have in the wake of this break in the tension, right? As you've described, it seems like if I understand correctly at all, I guess to me it just seems like it's all exploding. I guess if I could put it in one way, it seems like it is exploding. But maybe that's just an affectation of being a modern subject, is feeling like the world is exploding all the time. But I kind of feel that way. I feel like, and maybe once again, I have no concept of life in the Western world during the existence of the USSR, and whether or not it personally felt to the average citizen like there was that, was there ever a moment living with the USSR's presence thinking like, well, I guess there was for many theorists, that it was to say, well, I am thankful that they're there because they are motivating my government to do X, Y, and Z to help me out, to spare that. But I feel bad because I'm getting away from some other key aspects of Bataille's writing, which was the self-consciousness stuff. I'm really interested in that self-consciousness stuff and how that was supposed to happen for him. And again, I guess, okay, that's a way to bring it back to my original point. With this self-consciousness being no longer consciousness of something, but of the nothing of expenditure. That's the basic formula that I found for his self-consciousness. At the very end of the text, he talks about self-consciousness being the consciousness with nothing as its object, the nothing of expenditure. So this self-consciousness or consciousness of nothing but expenditure, it brings up questions in my mind in two senses. First, won't we still be living organisms that follow the flow of living organisms or vital impulses or whatever that have the starting and stopping that he talks about? That's my first question. First off, if we have any hope of becoming self-consciousnesses that are consciousness of nothing as our object, the nothing of expenditure, rather than the something, I guess, of productive consumption, consciousness of something, of the decisive meaning of an instant in which increase will resolve into expenditure. This will be precisely self-consciousness that is a consciousness that henceforth has nothing as its object. Decisive meaning of an instant in which increase will resolve into expenditure. I mean, what does that say for if we imagine, like, first off, okay, if to word my first question better, as in won't we still be human, I guess, is what and won't we still get into that? Like, yes, there are phases of expenditure, but aren't there yet again phases of growth within the deployment of wealth for a living organism, right? That he talks about, starting and stopping, filling up space, birds developing wings so they can fly. We butt up against our environment, we can't get any bigger, and then we figure things out and we expand. Is self-consciousness going to imply some sort of stopping to that expansion? Like, is self-consciousness going to imply like we're no longer focused on that expansion, we're over it, we don't need to engage in it, we're not as concentrated on it, we're somehow attached to like a cloud AI or something? I don't know, I'm just spitballing. How does self-consciousness look in terms of our relationship to desire and impulse and activity and creativity and expansion and industrial production and stuff like that? You see what I'm saying? And in that case, again, I'm still worried about the sovereign thing. Like, are we just under some universal ruling state power in order to make this happen? Those are my two questions. Those are my two things.
I don't have an answer to your question, but just my thoughts on the relationship between some of those. So, of course, I could be completely wrong again, but my reading of the general thesis of the book is that the general economy is a natural, almost cosmic motion. It's the way things happen in physics and and biology and so on. But that, and I'm getting this from stuff he said earlier in the book, that for whatever reason, I don't know if he would try to explain, but the emergence of rationality, and maybe that's connected to self-consciousness somehow, I don't know. But the emergence of rationality kind of threw a kink in the sense that rational analysis of our experience and of our economic relationships generates these limited economies that often then oppose the movement of the general economy. And so you get these, that was my reading of some of his story and some of those ancient civilizations like the Aztecs. They start off with an economic system that is relatively consistent with the general economy, but then over like 2 or 3 phases, it shifts more and more into becoming a limited economy that's about trade and exchange and accumulation of wealth and so on. And so they're like, there's this, again, I could be wrong, but the sense I get is there's always this general economy that is always, it's kind of like when you build a city, or you build anything, you put structure into it. It's like nature is always trying to break it down. The weeds are always trying to break through the concrete. The mold is always trying to set up in the walls. There are these natural forces that are always trying to break down, those structures that we've imposed on the world. And that's kind of the way I see the general economy. We keep erecting these rational structures of interpretation and of economics and of trade, and the general economy is always kind of eating away at that stuff. And so then you get these different phases and responses to that interaction. And then I don't know exactly how that fits with self-consciousness, other than there seems to be, I'm wondering if that movement, that tension between the general economy and the sort of rational economy, or rationality in general, is similar to this. He seems to say this sounds very Hegelian for my little knowledge of what Hunter's taught us, that there's an essential contradiction in self-consciousness, in that self-consciousness, let's see, this is the first paragraph on page 189. Doubtless it is paradoxical to tie a truth so intimate as that of self-consciousness, the return of being to full and irreducible sovereignty, to these completely external determinations. And then, a little further down, if self-consciousness is essentially the full possession of intimacy, we must return to the fact that all the possession of intimacy leads to a deception. A sacrifice can only posit a sacred thing. And so, he's hit this earlier, that it's like consciousness wants to find this sacredness that requires sacrifice, but the only way it can do that is by positing an object to sacrifice, a thing. And so, and again, he in that footnote, he refers back to some of the earlier stuff he said, so that there's this tension that is, I think, built into self-consciousness, where it wants an intimacy. My way of thinking about it, it wants this sort of pure intimacy that transcends subject object, but at the same time, it can only understand the world in terms of subject object. It has to have a thing to sacrifice. It has to have resources to expend. And so I'm wondering, I'm wondering if those two are related. And then I have the same reading of this, these last couple pages that I did about the economic stuff, that when he's talking about the mystics and so on, it seems to me, he thinks there's at least a possibility that humanity could engage with self-consciousness in a kind of way that would be more compatible with the general economy, with the movement of life and energy and so on. It's possible, but it's very difficult and probably unlikely. And I have the same, the same reading. I think he would say you could have an economic system that disposed of its expenditure in a completely wasteful sense. Like, for example, the United States just giving away billions and billions of dollars to developing economies with no expectation of return. And you wouldn't, I think he would say, you wouldn't have to have war if we could do that, but that both of those are unlikely possibilities given the current conditions in the world and given our track record of imposing rational form and structure on all this dynamism and so on. And again, it seems like there's echoes of Nietzsche, echoes of Hegel in that kind of analysis. But I don't know what it seems to me there's some relation between that essential economic tension and that essential tension in self-consciousness. I can't quite put it together.
But I think you're right, Nevitt. I mean, I think it's the main point is he doesn't think it's likely that we won't blow ourselves up because of the dynamic of economy, but it's possible. And one of the reasons why, I mean, and in some ways, this is what people argue, that the very terror of nuclear war would cause countries to take a step back from it, right? And no matter how competitive they were, they wouldn't let the competition go beyond a certain point, right? Because with the sheer amount of weapons delivery systems the United States, Soviet Union, now Russia has, I mean, what is survival if there was a general nuclear war, right? I mean, you're talking about 100 million people at a minimum gone in the United States, 100 million in Russia, radioactivity, so I think it wasn't a dead end. It was, yes, the probability is probably we'll blow ourselves up, but there is a possibility that we won't. And he was just trying to be honest. He was trying to be consistent with his own analysis throughout this book, for him saying, I think that for a major way, it's not looking good for the future.
Yeah, it seemed like he was positing the general betterment of all of the lives, like the quality of life of our standard of living of the global community. It seemed like he kind of posited that as like this. He makes kind of he posits it in a certain way, and then kind of criticizes a way that it could be misunderstood or misinterpreted. This betterment of people's lives as being, it seems like it's like the be all end all. It's like it's as if in this way of looking at things, the final goal was given. He's like, yeah, it seems like the betterment of the lives of all people. In some sense, it seems it's as if, yeah, that's the goal of all of our action, of all of our systems, or all of our struggles. In the end, everything falls into place. It takes up its assigned role. And I wanted to know actually what you guys thought he meant when he said today Truman would appear to be blind to preparing for the final and secret apotheosis. But he said, but that is obviously an illusion. More open the mind discerns, instead of an antiquated teleology, the truth that silence alone does not betray. And I think, yeah, it's not an antiquated teleology in the sense that it's just going to unfold. In that sense, it's just gonna happen. All of our struggles are for the good, and all of our evils are in certain, like some sort of Plato style, like all of the events of evil are just operations of goodness deploying evil for its own ends or whatever, and the good will win out, or there's a teleological unfolding that'll occur that gives rise to the betterment or improvement of the standard of living of all people. This antiquated teleology, he says, the truth that silence alone does not betray. I agree with you guys when you say that the future does not look good. Just that as a statement, just the future does not look good for this potential dynamic peace in the system. Like there's a potential for it, but it does not look good. Now, in what way does it not look good? How does it not look good? How can we make it look better? Why does it not look good? I mean, I guess, like you said, given our track record. But I'm just thinking, when he says the truth that silence alone does not betray, truth that silence alone does not betray, that makes me think of that prior part of the text where he said that belief that only darkness will meet the will to see. And maybe it's echoing that in the sense that we could say that silence meets the will to speak or to hear. I don't know. But what is that silence? Because it makes me think of two things. First, actually, no, just one thing that's important, and it's Zizek talking about sometimes silence or political non-participation is one of the most effective forms of participation that are available. And another thing that he also says, that this also makes me think of is when I think of that silence, I think of contemplation. I think of time to think instead of time to act. Like the only option that we have with this thing that the truth that silence alone does not betray. I mean, maybe it has something to do with the intimacy thing, and this, I don't know. But like, so I don't know how the intimacy thing fits in. See, now I'm with you, Nevitt. It's like, yeah, I'm getting a handle on this, on these problems of self-consciousness and these problems of economy. But yeah, I'm having some trouble linking them together and discerning, because at certain points it's almost like an optical illusion that I'm looking at as I'm reading the Bataille, because like I'm having a hard time kind of discerning what he's generally saying. And I'll say this. I've had some trouble discerning what he's saying sometimes because he writes in a way that's kind of sometimes a lot of things are implicit or implied, and sometimes he uses doublespeak or metaphor or a little bit of whimsy and creativity and getting across his message. Hegel does that too. Hegel writes in a similar way. I mean, he's much more technical, but Hegel writes in a similar way. And when Hegel does it, I am okay with it because I have a general sense of what he's talking about and where he's going and the points that he would probably prefer for me to understand, right? But with Bataille, I don't get that same sense. And so sometimes I feel myself like the wires in my own brain crossing because he says things in an implicit or kind of, metaphorical or open-ended way. And when I'm confronted with that sort of language, I try to interpret what they're meaning. And with Hegel, I've had kind of a cheat sheet baked into the surface of my brain over a couple of years. So now, anytime that there's any sort of doublespeak going on, it's like I'm a well-trained dog, like a Pavlovian experiment gone horribly wrong. If I read metaphor in a book, I see Hegel, and I kind of try to, at least when I'm reading that or something about that, I try to have a general sense of where it's going or where it's coming from or what the general ideas are that people ascribe to it, But with Bataille, I don't have that. And so he will say something, and so I'm trying to parse out. I'm having a hard time parsing out. Yes, I'm having a hard time parsing out what he is trying to say versus what I am like seeing in the phrases, given like Ripley pointed out, my indoctrination campaign that I've been, running for some time on myself and others, this macabre experiment. So when I see the phrase "only silence doesn't betray the truth," I think of things like Zizek, like Lacanian, Hegelian psychoanalytic Marxism. But that probably doesn't have any place here. You know what I'm saying? And I don't, that's why I'm so weirded out by this discussion of intimacy. But I like the part about intimacy always involving some sort of deception. That the notion of self-consciousness is kind of constitutively built on this paradox. But I mean, yeah, once again, I don't know. I mean, Zizek kind of describes something similar to this consciousness of nothing. But it's more of like in the vein of like subjective destitution, the end result of psychoanalysis, less than nothingness, this conceivable less than nothingness. That's the kind of direction that goes in. But this seems to be sticking with just this notion of nothing. It's staying kind of, on level. It's not falling too deep into a German idealist rabbit hole that we need a companion book to understand. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's a good thing. It's a good thing about this book. But oddly, paradoxically enough, it makes it harder for me to understand. And so I'm like, I feel almost embarrassed, but I just have trouble, navigating these weeds. This last section, figuring out where self-consciousness ends and how it begins, and the conversation about politics. Where does that begin? And how does he resolve that? Because he brings it up, that whole like, oh, it'd be weird to think that self-consciousness could be brought about by such determinate or such particular determinations. He's like, oh, wouldn't that be so foolish? I don't even get how he resolved that. I don't know. I'm just confused by a lot of the things that he says in those last couple of pages. And I'm still confused. I'm still questioning, does it require some sort of universal sovereign? And what are like the prospect of becoming self-conscious? First off, I mean, like, like, yes, like Eric said, it's kind of important for us to have agency in history or whatever. But like, what, again, what does that imply for the experience of the average subject in this new self-conscious era? And what kind of state do they live in? I guess these are just the thoughts I'm having. I don't know if there is an answer. I don't even know if there is an answer. Maybe that's why silence is what doesn't portray. Maybe that's why. But I don't know. That's it. That's all.
Well, am I on mute? No, I'm not. Okay. I was thinking this of in terms of credit. Like that's the thing that came to my mind when I was reading this chapter. Like when a capitalist system has a certain amount of expenditure when it comes to the productive labor of the employees, there's you want to keep that productive labor cost low, but you still need those employees to spend a certain amount of money in order to keep the capitalistic system going. So how does one do that if you want to keep the system self-regulating to the point where expenditure doesn't break away from that? And I was thinking about the introduction of credit into the American economy with the capitalist system and how much it solved that problem. Because in that point, expenditure was really just me getting a line of credit for a car or a home or whatever it is. And then no longer do I actually own that object. It's something that I owe back into the system to keep it going. So I was thinking about that in the terms of consciousness and self-consciousness. When my consciousness or participation in the community is living the American dream of having a car and a white picket fence and living in constant debt on credit, it's for me an example of expenditure that is more of a mechanization system. So there is no participation there. I'm getting a line of credit on an object and feeling that I'm somehow participating in the community. I'm not really sacrificing anything in order to give that to obtain that object. It'd be a lot more different instead of getting a line of credit where I have to go back into a job system and participate and pay off my credit card bill. If I had to give something that was personally very precious to me to get, to feel like I'm participating in the community. And I'm wondering if that's what he's saying by sacrifice and potlatch. I'm wondering if what he's providing in all of these historical and economic systems is more of a provisional hypothesis. He's like, we got it right. We're close to getting it right. We just need to reorder how we're doing it, these things. And particularly when it comes to expenditure, and less of an aspect of more of a sovereignty and maybe more of a participation in an open form of democratic socialism where we realize that whatever it is that we're obtaining is transitory. And by having it be personal in democratic socialism, it gives us a sense of community that has us break out of this cycle of mechanization, which is just, a constant form of war or violence in the human condition. So yeah, ultimately get rid of credit cards and replace credit cards with human sacrifices. There we go. But honestly, that's what I was thinking. What type of participation or identity do I have? I don't really feel like I have any when it comes to engaging in that way. But it's a lot more meaningful when like I cook for someone or I provide somebody with something that I feel is a sacrifice of something that's really important to me, either my time or food or something that's just not a communal participation that's more than just let's go out and engage in commerce.
But I guess my worry about that is that on one hand, I mean, I've recognized myself as being kind of detached from all this stuff around me as a result of not as a result, but kind of involved with this series of economic and social factors or constructs that define my relationship to myself, my surroundings, my objects, my family, my loved ones. A word for it would be alienated. I it's like, a way I think about it is that I, as a subject, as a capitalist subject, I mean, this is a stupid metaphor or illustration of the way that I think about it. This is really stupid because it doesn't actually work if you investigate it too much at all. But it's like, imagine that I did exist or might have existed at some point. Let's imagine I'm like a Plato's like eternal soul going through the stream of time or something. And I'm getting yanked out of the crucible or out of the whatever the thing by the demiurge, and I'm being transformed from this chaotic mass into a soul with all these little determinate qualities. You know, I'm this, I'm that, I'm whatever, and then I get shot down like a big star, like onto Earth, and I happen to be caught by, you know, some like imagine a historical epoch turned into a like personified. Capitalism catches me, it sees me trying to become a person. I'm about to, you know, go from being just this amorphous, formless soul into this factual entity and being. And it says, no, 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 you're not going to tell you can go on in, but you're going to have to let go of all this business about you. And I'm like, what do you mean? And they say all of your particular determinations or characteristics. And then like the scene in Talladega Nights, where Will Ferrell is splashed with a large bucket of water. That's what I'm thinking of by Billy Bob Thornton or whoever it is that's in that movie. I am splashed with like a bucket of sulfuric acid, and all of my particular determinations and qualities melt away, and I turn into a gray pile of goo. And then I'm brushed out the door, like, okay, go on, get out there and be somebody, you know, go get a credit card. And my point is that this is something that Marx talks about, is capital's tendency, or maybe not even tendency, maybe I could use a stronger word, but I'm too much of a coward to do so. I'll say tendency to distance or remove a subject from their particular substantive determinations that do not revolve around quantitative determinations of currency.
Yeah, alienation.
Okay, yes. So my point is about that alienation. Yes, and species being. Okay, I'm alienated from my species being. Or my point is, I don't think that I am. See, I was gonna say, like, that's why I don't see much hope in myself for ever being intimate with a person, which is sad, but that's okay. Lots of things are sad. You know, but I think that Bataille would even agree with me. Maybe he would say, like, yeah, that's the fucked up thing, is you try to find intimacy, you want to find intimacy, and then you just find this deception. And I don't know if he's saying that that's maybe he's saying that goes beyond just capital. That's just a part of the experience of the general economy or something, or the experience of being a subject, that in intimacy we find some sort of deception. But maybe I'm misunderstanding that. But my point with all that is to say that that is why I'm so confused about all of this talk of intimacy, because I don't see it. I don't see intimacy as an option for me. That's my point.
So I have a synthetic interpretation, which is probably wrong because it's too broad. But trying to tie some of these things together, just one thing, actually, this is just a sort of a small note, that the top of 189, you know, when Hunter was saying, what is this business about sovereignty and determination, self-consciousness? If you look at that footnote 18, he says, self-consciousness, the return of being to full and irreducible sovereignty. The footnote of 18 says, which is freedom in the moment, independent of a task needing to be carried out. And so I'm thinking, you know, when he says it's paradoxical to tie self-consciousness to these determinations. I mean, it almost sounds like he's channeling Sartre there, that, he's thinking of self-consciousness as freedom. And yet and I think, again, I think it's because the nature of self-consciousness itself is paradoxical. And so here's my sort of synthetic reading. Also on page 189, the third paragraph, if self-consciousness is essentially the full possession of intimacy, we must return to the fact that all possession of intimacy leads to a deception. And then the footnote 20 refers back to page 129. And at the bottom of 129, he says, religion in general answered the desire that man always had to find himself, to regain an intimacy that was always strangely lost. But the mistake of all religion is to always give man a contradictory answer, an external form of intimacy. And I think that's the condition of self-consciousness, is that the self-consciousness wants this intimacy, but because it has to posit an object, it seeks it in an external thing, it seeks an internal intimacy in an external thing, which is paradoxical and doomed to failure. Sounds like Hunter's version of Hegel. So successive solutions only exacerbate the problem. Intimacy is never separated from external elements without which it could not be signified. Where we think we have caught hold of the grail, we have only grasped a thing. What is left in our hands is only a cooking pot. And so, anyway, so that's some of what he says about intimacy. And then I went all the way back to the chapter where he's talking about the Aztecs. And again, no one has ever said they saw this, but I see this in those early chapters, both about the Aztecs and the potlatch, this process of transition from a society that was more in tune with the general economy to one that became less and less so. And now what I'm wondering is part of that process of falling out of tune with the general economy is also part of the process of the fuller development of self-consciousness. And so in the stuff on the Aztecs, when he's talking about sacrifice, this is on page 54, at the bottom, he says the value of warfare in Mexican society cannot mislead us. It was not a military society. Religion remained oblivious to its key workings. Wait, no, that's not what I wanted to read. Sorry. This is the very bottom of 53 and the top of 54. The bottom of 53, the body of the sacrificed was his by right. He would carry it home, setting aside the head, and the rest would be eaten at a banquet, cooked without salt or spices, but eaten by the invited guests only, not by the sacrificer, who regarded his victim as a son, as a second self. And I think that's a kind of deep intimacy. The sacrificed was a second self. And he makes another comment on similar comment some other place where he says the sacrificer and the one sacrificed, he talks about how the sacrificed being was brought into the family and made a part of the family. And when that being was sacrificed, it was again like sacrificing oneself. And he referred to, I don't remember if he called it intimacy, but the early Aztec sense of the world was sacred. There was no distinction between sacred and secular. There was only the sacred. And they lived thoroughly and fully immersed in the world of the God, the world of the sun. And they were so deeply and intimately involved in the world that it required their own action to keep the sun, God, moving. And so there's this, intimacy in the sense of intimacy with others, fewer barriers, but also this deep religious intimacy of deep, involvement in the world. But then if you follow through that chapter on the Aztecs, we've got from the primacy of religion to the primacy of military effectiveness. And the top of page 55, he says, the extreme importance of warfare had been brought had brought about a significant change for the Aztecs in the direction of the rationality of an enterprise, which introduces together with the concern for results and for effective force a beginning of humanity as against the cruel violence of consumption. And so, that's why I say there's this shift from this deep intimacy into this rational economy, this rational enterprise. And then there's another stage or two, which becomes even more so something like, the Aztec society loses even more of this intimacy. And so what I'm wondering then is if he would say, and the reason, that this is maybe wrong is because I don't know that he ever says anything explicitly, but in the early Aztec society, there is actually less self-consciousness, but a deeper intimacy with one another and with the world. And then as they begin to kind of break away from the general economy and start creating these rational economies, I'm wondering if he would say the sort of self-consciousness as being able to kind of extract oneself out of this intimate world and view it as a thing. Now the world is a thing full of things rather than a world of deep experience and intimacy. It becomes a world of things. And I'm wondering if the emergence of self-consciousness in the sense of having this stark distinction between self and world, between my, isolated individual ego and the world of divine and social experience, if those two are tied up together, and so then what I'm wondering if he would say at the end, it's kind of, and again, maybe I'm just because I've had all these, Hegelian words whispered in my ear by Hunter, but that maybe at this point, I mean, it's almost like to bring Eric's word in from the other seminar, the Aztecs, in a sense, lived in a prelapsarian world, perhaps, prior to the strong emergence of self-consciousness and object. And once you lose that, you never get it back. And so that today, we are in this world of self-consciousness in the sense of having this stark distinction between self and things. And then I wonder, so at the bottom of 189, a point must be uncovered where dry lucidity coincides with the sense of the sacred. This implies the reduction of the sacred world to the component most purely opposed to things, its reduction to pure intimacy. And it sounds like he's talking about, to me, given that, perhaps fabricated overview, is that he wants to find a way to somehow regain an intimacy in the world of things, because we're never going to go back to that world, that prelapsarian world, that world before self-consciousness was broken away in this stark way from the intimacy of the world. We're never going to get back there. And so, I'm wondering if here at the end is he's just saying or asking the question, is there a way to return to some kind of intimacy in the world of things somehow? And maybe maybe that is somehow related to the question, is there any way that we can somehow transform economies into something that is more returned to something that is more in tune with the general economy?
Okay, so yeah, I was going to draw attention. So he said first the contradiction of self-consciousness to these external determinations. Well, part of what I thought he was saying, it was kind of seemed very contradictory, is because he's talking about self-consciousness as this immediate experience, like especially in the very early stuff, but sovereignty is immediate experience. But I give the immediate experience to do the thing for itself, not for the rational calculations that will come. And then these he's talked about the Soviet Union's plans and the Marshall Plans, all these big governments, tactical calculations of who's going to gain the political power in there. And I want to bring attention to, as remember, this is thinking, but also part of what it seems is a bit interesting was going back to the page 76, so way back, he says, I remember this because I remember this being interesting. In this respect, present-day society is a huge counterfeit, where the truth of wealth has underhandedly slipped into extreme poverty. The true luxury and the real potluck of our times falls to the poverty-stricken, that is, to the individual who lies down and scoffs. A genuine luxury requires complete contempt for riches, the somber indifference of the individual who refuses to work and make his life on the hand of an infinity ruined splendor, and on the other, a silent, insolent, and laborious lie of the rich. Right. And so that kind of almost reminded me of like the Cynics almost, like in the Greek Cynics. And, there's a squander of, material riches. I mean, their rejection of material riches, but they say that they're actually living the richest lives possible, by rejecting it, which I thought was interesting because he's giving almost a kind of, voluntary, the only way out of our, current, rational, times is like a voluntary poverty, a rejection of accumulating things. And here, but now here he's, speaking of the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan is a job to, raise the living standards, and that seems very different. And I agree. It seems like why he's talking about this paradox here partially was because, says the Marshall Plan is not communism. It's not remotely communism. It's just a tactical plan. But he's, like he says, on page 189, or at the bottom. I'm not gonna quote, but he's like, seems like he's saying, like, he's trying at the end. He's trying to get through the paradox of, how can we, on like a global scale instead of just on this individual, individuals going and throwing off the chains of, accumulating commodities, can we, as a society, like on a global scale, start getting out of this, capitalist system where everything is stuck on, a instrumental reason. And I think that's part of the paradox he's trying to say, is how can we bring back this original thing I was talking about, the profitless expenditure back onto this like global scale and a system that would actually work. So he's trying to outline, and he sees that in the Marshall Plan, even though it's not that this is what we would have to do, like, but more generally. And so I think.
I'm wondering too, like when I think about it, if like, because on 189 he says the sacrifice can only posit a sacred thing. The sacred thing externalizes intimacy. It makes visible on the outside that which is really within. And this is on 189. And I was thinking about that, and I was thinking, what is the difference? Like, if in a capitalist economy, if I like, say it's your birthday and I buy you a cup of coffee, does that cup of coffee express intimacy? Am I sacrificing something of my time to buy you like a $7 Starbucks? Like, the object itself doesn't really describe intimacy. And conversely too, if I were to like, give you a homemade gift that was given to me by my son, it's very, very important to me. This object in and of itself does not have any intimacy. It's just a way of expressing it. So if I were to give you something that was important to me as a sacrifice that I knew I'll never get that back, this art, this homemade gift, these things that are intimate to us as human beings, really whatever object we have is the object itself isn't the intimacy. It's an externalization of it, as he put it. It's that act of sacrifice that I think he's trying to get at from not only a descriptive but a prescriptive standpoint. When we engage in an economic practice that requires us to maybe not only recognize ourselves in the objects, but in the intimacy that is expressed through participation in the community and sacrifice, and in that language, that we do find some component of ourselves in others. And I'm thinking he's suggesting that a purely militaristic or a purely capitalistic system doesn't offer that intimacy in any way. It's just the equivalent of buying someone a meaningless cup of coffee.
But then, in that scenario that you described, where you give that, are you saying, that right now, given your present circumstances, those hypothetical scenarios that you listed, where you were engaging in with something that held some sort of intimacy for you, or it was an intimate relationship or experience or exchange, let's say you're giving a gift to somebody that you really care about, are you saying that that is just like a hypothetical illustration of an intimacy that we can't experience in the capitalist model? Or are you saying that that is a way in which you can point to intimacy, and it is also occurring under this capital, because you are a capitalist subject, what are you feeling? What do you think?
I guess I'm saying, or at least what I'm thinking he's interpreting is that there has to be some human component in the object that it's projecting onto it as the sacrifice. It's not the object itself that provides the intimacy. Like, we're all yearning for recognition from one another and to be seen. And when we replace that yearning for self-recognition with just an object or a participation in an economic system, it will just essentially self-perpetuate. So if intimacy comes not, is the object doesn't matter. It's an externalization. It can be anything. It's the association of what the community has with that object and that sacrifice that is the important aspect. One relies on communal participation and language for understanding what intimacy is, and the other is just engagement into a mechanization of economic participation. So I think when you lean towards just the mechanized aspect of economic participation, it's always going to try to maintain itself. It's always going to regulate. But when you look at what we are in nature, we're systems with excess energy, a need to be seen, a need to have our self-consciousness seen by other people. To engage in that intimacy, the object doesn't matter. It's the communal component, the act of sacrifice that does, which is contingent upon what that environment is or what the sacrifice is to that environment. There is no one cookie cutter solution, no one political system that's going to solve this human condition. It's going to be fluid and dynamic, but there has to be a component of sacrifice expressed in the community that has to have that intimacy. And part of that is destruction. Giving it away is the destruction. But just expending and destroying for the sake of expending and destroying, there's no community in that. There's no participation. I'm just a cog in a machine, participating as a cog in a machine.
Well, I was trying to connect that passage, a sacrifice can only posit a sacred thing, back to his earlier discussion about, again, this need for the world, the need for intimacy in the sense of having a sacred world. And part of the purpose of sacrifice, sacred, they have the same root. And I, thought, at least in the early part, when he was talking in these earlier examples, that part of the purpose of sacrifice was to show, not exactly a contempt, but to show the unimportance of, in a sense, these physical things, that their annihilation then, revealed one's intimacy with some other deeper reality, like the sacred world. And so the sacrifice to some degree was for the sake of exhibiting and maybe even to some degree entering into this more sacred intimacy with the world. And I'm not sure how that fits or doesn't fit with what Joseph was saying. I was just trying to reconnect that back to his earlier similar comments about sacrificing things and even sacrificing people. That sacrifice and sacred were part of the same process. That's why you sacrifice things. That's why they're, like in the Jewish tradition, I don't think he mentioned this, but when we were back in those earlier passages, if you read the Old Testament, you set aside these things for the sacred use. You put these things aside because they are for the divine. They're not to be, like the Levites, the priestly class, they were set aside. They were not involved in the economy, the physical economy of the society, because they were set aside for a sacred purpose. So, sacrifice has to do with setting aside, or in some case, destruction of the useful as a symbol, or maybe even as a way of entering into this mode of intimacy.
I don't know if I would say he's looking for like an external reality or some like higher plane. I would wonder if he's just saying this is the sacred plane. This is the almost from a materialist standpoint, like the acceptance of the common fate and participation of the act is what allows it. Because I was looking back on page 46 where he does mention self-consciousness, and particularly in regards to sacrifice in the War of the Aztecs. And he says the serious, and this is page 46, the serious humanity of growth becomes civilized, more gentle, but it tends to confuse gentleness with the values of life and life's tranquil duration with its poetic dynamism. Under these conditions, the clear knowledge it generally has of things cannot become a full self-knowledge. It is misled by what it takes for full humanity, that is, humanity at work, living in order to work without ever fully enjoying the fruits of its labors. And I'm wondering if that's what he's saying. The full aspect of humanity is that sacrificial participation. This is the sacred realm.
Well, I get, I think where I would agree with you is, and this goes back to what I was saying, this interpretation that in the ancient Aztec society at the beginning, they actually had a deep intimacy with the world and with one another, but they didn't have a lot of self-consciousness. I mean, it reminds me of Nietzsche's description of the warriors. They were really energetic and exciting guys, but they weren't too smart. It was the sneaky priests, the clever priests, in which consciousness first entered the world. And so I wonder, the Aztecs in their intimacy have this kind of this incomplete self-conscious naivete. We don't have that anymore. We're way past that, and we're never going to get back that. And so where I think maybe I would agreeing with Joseph, not so much in the ancient world, but in the contemporary world, because again, I think, on my reading, he's saying at this juncture where we are, we're never going to get back there. So what we have to do is figure out somehow to return sacredness to the world of things. And like you said, somehow make this world sacred. I don't know how to do that, but at the very bottom of 189, this comes down, in fact, as in the experience of the mystics, to the intellectual contemplation without shape or form, as against the seductive appearance of visions and divinities and myths. And I don't really know what he means, contemplation without shape or form, although frankly, it sounds like one of the Zen sutras, but as against the seductive appearance of visions, divinities, and myths, maybe he's saying, for example, in the ancient world, they had that kind of access to intimacy. We don't have that anymore. And so we have to find a way to make to resacralize the secular, which, I don't know, I have those vague recollections of Chase talking about the weird cults that they were in, that he helped generate. And maybe that was part of that effort to somehow, create something like a spiritualized reality in some way.
Nevitt, I mean, if you think about it, go back to that sentence at the very bottom of page 189 you just read. With, to intellectual contemplation without shape or form, as against the seductive appearances of visions, divinities, and myths. When he's writing, the world is divided up into different religious realms, right? There's the Christian, there's the Muslim, there's the Hindu, Judaic. I mean, there's a whole range of world religions, and none of them are unifying globally, right? By definition, they're separating. And so I think what he's saying is, I'm guessing from your insights that what Bataille is suggesting is the existing religious traditions cannot do the job for what needs to be done for us to reconnect and not have this alienation, and to make the world sacred again. And we're going to have to go beyond, as against the seductive appearances. So there's going to have to be a new sacred ethos that will, I hate to use the word transcend, but will exist. And this is the way maybe we can get that. But I do think your take on his analysis of the Aztecs and others, and he didn't mention it, but from the little I've read about the ancient civilizations, Mesopotamia, Egypt, there was not the separation of the sacred from the profane. Lightning hitting a tree, that was one of the gods. I mean, if someone keeled over, it wasn't, I mean, you could have theology, I guess, without necessarily being systematic, in that it was like, okay, why did this person die? And so you kind of work backwards from this death, but a real connection between what we would call the natural world, the anthropological human world, cultural world, and the divine world is all just of one piece.
And Joey, mentioned that comment about nothingness. On page 190, the big paragraph that at the very end, he says, see, in other words, becoming conscious of the decisive meaning of an instant in which increase, the acquisition of something, will resolve into expenditure. I don't really know what that means, and this will be precisely self-consciousness, that is, a consciousness that henceforth has nothing at its object. And the footnote 21 says, nothing but pure interiority, which is not a thing, which sounds like Kierkegaard, interestingly, pure interiority. So I really don't know what that means, but that makes me wonder, is this a way of pointing toward some sacredness without an object? In other words, I don't even want to say a secular religion, but some sort of sacredness that is not yet a religion. That there's this sort of nothingness at the core. But I'm speculating because I don't really understand those sentences.
I guess I was just making that comment about the nothingness in relation to that sentence about the experience of the mystics to intellectual contemplation without shape or form, as against the seductive appearances of visions, divinities, myths. And kind of just like, I don't know, I was finding myself with some sort of resistance to the phrasing of finding sacred thing, or even like a secular sacred. It felt like maybe the sacred is not ever going to be in the thing, no matter what it is. It feels like he's saying like the reversal of value from what I am able to acquire So kind of like giving up that and kind of like refinding nothingness, and just like being able to kind of like empty yourself. And almost like return to zero. I mean, the concept that Hunter was saying earlier about where the German idealism or something going less than nothing, right? And it seems like Bataille here is saying like nothingness, like this like drop from positive acquisition, something consciousness, this drop to zero, to nothing. And that seemed different from like finding something that would be capable of externalizing my intimacy. And I guess I also like found this thought kind of going through my head of like the giving away of something is like saying like this is not intimate. Like this is not, you know, where I find my intimacy. You know, I spend money, I buy someone a cup of coffee because it's like it's not me, or I waste something, right? I guess I'm like playing to that theme that Hunter, I feel like Hunter mentioned earlier, of like I can't externalize my intimacy. I don't know if that's what Bataille's saying, but like I'm seeing if that teases out of these last few paragraphs. I guess it feel like it plugs into the comments he makes too of saying like silence alone does not betray.
So, you know, I'm sorry to interject Zen in here again, but here's I'm actually, you know, sort of trying to support what Joey's saying. In page 190, you know, in the middle of that longest paragraph, in reality, let's see. In reality, the increase should be situated in relation to the moment in which it will resolve into pure expenditure. But this is precisely the difficult transition. In fact, it goes against consciousness in the sense that the latter tries to grasp some object of acquisition, something, not the nothing of pure expenditure. It is a question of arriving at the moment when consciousness will cease to be conscious of something. In other words, of becoming conscious of the decisive meaning of an instant in which increase, the acquisition of something, will resolve into expenditure. This will be precisely self-consciousness, that is, a consciousness that henceforth has nothing as its object. That sounds very Zen to me.
And I guess to me, like that is what he was saying. Like that's, I don't know, maybe I'm like trying to romanticize it, but this idea of like that's where the sacred is found, in that moment when you're like giving it up and realizing that like it doesn't take the form of the object, it doesn't externalize, and it's just like it to me it almost feels like a moment of hopelessness, but like that's the sacrifice, where like the instant of your acquisition becoming nothing, like you're giving it away, that like instant of just like, yes, almost just like freedom.
Like taking the last cup of coffee in the pot when you really want one, but you know your partner wants it, right? But you're like, there you go. There's more intimacy in that. You know, it doesn't matter what the object is.
I mean, just, you know, pure expenditure, pure giving away. You know, I mean, you know, like self-consciousness becoming pure expenditure, pure throwing out. Anyway, yeah, this gets, like, you know, maybe this is why people accused him of being a mystic.
I think this is why we should read volume 2, because he goes into this more and we could talk about it more.
Before we go there, I mean, what's all of your sense of his sense of the word intimacy? Because that seems to be, you know, really critical.
Well, maybe I'm reading too much many other philosophers in here, but I think what he means by intimacy, well, like it is the lack of separation between self and the world, I guess. You know, a deep involvement, you know, again, like that, the Aztec thing where there was sort of a lack of self-consciousness in the sense of being self-aware of oneself in a world, but it's like full immersion in a world of experience and meaning and value, And we're one, that at least that's my sense of intimacy, but I'm not sure.
No, I mean, I hope you didn't mind, didn't mind me asking that, because, in today's US culture, we seem to be drenched in sexuality, but not necessarily sensuality. And,
I like that, Ed. That's a good saying.
well, yeah, and the older saying, right? Difference between making love and getting laid. And, and then your point, Joseph, about you remembered that somebody else wanted the cup of coffee and you were thinking about them and you were going to get that, right? Most people couldn't necessarily say that would be intimacy at all. But it seems to me, being, and I hate to use this phrase, but being in tune to truly understand the person, or at least part of a person, from the inside out, not conceptualizing or categorizing another person, but fully accepting that person for who and what they are, and just understanding them on their own terms. And so I could see the term intimacy being adaptable beyond interpersonal relationships. And it seems to me we've lost our intimacy with the natural world. We view it in a very, what's the word I want to use? What we can get from it, instrumental, right? And a real, to me, a disturbing little book is The Giving Tree. I don't know if you ever read it, by Shel Silverstein. It's a strange little book, but it's always the tree's not there to enjoy the tree. It's what can I get from the tree? And I won't ruin it for you if you want to read it. It won't take that long. But and again, reminding this me talking reminds me of Nevitt's points earlier, which is, I mean, what parts of the world today do we really see as sacred? I mean, from my understanding, for the Japanese, Kyoto is a sacred space. For Roman Catholics, Rome, or at least part of Rome, is holy. Canterbury for Anglicans, the Four Corners area for certain Native Americans. But what's sacred? What have most human beings in most places lost any sense of sacred space and intimacy with the natural world?
Good points.
Sacredness would not have to, I mean, maybe it's a poor word because it's such a loaded word, but again, sorry to interject Zen, but in Zen, I think the world is not meaningful. The world is meaning. And they'll talk about like I don't know, the tea ritual, which is is kind of a Zen thing. Every object, you could say it's sacred, but the idea is you're completely and intimately aware of every object and of what you're doing with it. And it's highly ritualized, but the point of the ritual is not to ritualize. The point of the ritual is to allow you to be absolutely involved in the immediacy of what is happening right now, right here, right now. I'm picking up this cup. I'm picking up this whisk. I'm stirring, but not in that self-conscious way of like, literally, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, but just this absolute full awareness of what one is immediately doing. And there's a kind of, the word in that kind of experience, I don't know maybe intimacy is the word. I mean, there's a kind of sacredness that emerges, but not sacredness in the sense of like a divine, I mean, you could kind of call it divine, but it's just like everything has value and immediacy. And so that's why I almost, these last pages, that's what that sounds like to me, is there's this like immediate awareness of what's happening right here, right now. And it all has this intensity, this it in a sense kind of glows like the world at sunset. It's just got this intensity to it. So maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm interjecting too much Zen into it, but that's
No,
what
it's
it made me think of.
but I mean, there could be some kind of overlap. I mean, it seemed like when you were talking of it too, the phrase infused with meaning just popped into my head as you were talking about the tea ritual, right? We've lost the sense of craftsmanship. Maybe this is going too far afield, but everything's mass produced. Everything's on a wheel. Let's see how fast we can. What was that phrase from Who Framed Roger Rabbit? Restaurants that serve rapidly prepared food. I love that phrase, right? They didn't call it fast food, it was rapidly prepared food. And there's no sense of, and you brought up a sunset, right? Who looks at a sunset anymore? Who walks through a forest? Not for exercise, not, because their doctor said they had to get a certain number of feet in or steps in, but to be. And it seems like every time we turn around, we're doing more and more things to alienate ourselves from ourselves, from each other, from the worlds we're living in.
I have really enjoyed tonight's discussion. This has been phenomenal.
Well, lucky for you, there'll be more in the summer.
We're gonna read Ayn Rand in the summer.
I'm out. Hard pass.
It's what Nevitt months ago you said, like Nietzsche commenting, like hearing that someone was writing in opposition to Mill. It was like, why?
Yeah, that's Nietzsche's thing. It's like, meh.
Yeah. Don't
Why
waste
bother?
time. Yeah, why bother?
Maybe instead of reading a book in the summer, we all just do the tea ceremony
For 2 hours together.
for 2 hours.
That's it.
Yeah, gotta
Every
keep the
week.
time frame.
Maybe we should all
guys.
meet together at one of those places that has float tanks and all float in the float tank.
Never been in one of those.
You're
I'd try it.
I have. My
I've
mind
done
spent
it.
the whole time yammering at me. Yeah. You're supposed to
Yeah.
lay there and your mind's supposed to, but my mind was just like yakety, 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 yakety.
I did it for 90 minutes and I remember, I'm just kind of guessing at the time mark, but maybe like halfway through, my body just finally like gave way and started to trust. And they'll tell you that too, because they'll say, your nervous system doesn't trust just being able to float in water. Your first few times, even your nervous system's kind of tight. It's going to hold like tension, particularly in the neck. They offer you like pillows, like water float pillows. But they say like, it takes an amount of time for your body to kind of orient and release, and for your nervous system to kind of just like turn off of like being in like, I'm floating in water, this is a threat. And then once that turns off, you kind of like slip into that stage. And I do remember like, I was kind of just thinking. And then at one point I did slip into this, just like, whoa, I just feel kind of nice. And
So
just
after
relaxing.
it took several visits for that to happen.
It happened to me the first time, but I
Really?
did it for 90 minutes, and I'm guessing maybe like at the 50-minute mark, it kind of like I slipped into that next stage. I just remember thinking it was really interesting. Like it was a very distinct shift in my like mental state of mind.
I really want to try it. I'm just scared that I'm going to get into that relaxed state of mind and like pee in the water or something. Like I legit am scared of that. Like I'll pee beforehand, and no matter what happens, I'll end up peeing in the water or something.
What's wrong
I
with
think
being in
they
the water?
flushed the tub between persons, so
But it's
All
not, I'm
right.
not like worried I'm gonna be climbing into somebody's pee tank. I'm worried that I'm just, I mean, I guess maybe they flush it out so I won't feel that guilty. That somebody else is gonna have to climb into my stew. But still, I'm gross. I don't belong in polite society like that. Like that's not for me. There's not a place for me to go, you know, I'm not. I don't know.
Well, if you want, we can just hose you down in a backyard, you know, try to get some kind of experience for you.
I think we should just drop him off on an island somewhere, so he can be by himself.
I'm hearing pool party. That's what
God.
I'm hearing.
Do not want to see me in a bathing suit.
I'm wearing a shirt now. I'm not. Yeah, that's all it'll be.
There was a movie years ago, I want to say it was the 1980s, which for you all means it was ancient, even though it's not that old, where a person was left in a tank for like a month. So he regressed biologically, you know, to
Altered states.
altered states. Was that what it was?
Show, the movie.
He's kind of darting around like a lizard and, you know, starts getting acclimated.
Yeah, the component I think of altered states of genetic atavism was like really strong Lovecraftian components back in the 80s when they were trying to make a Lovecraft movie. So I've yet to see one other than Color of Space that's really decent. Sorry, tangential.
No, I brought that movie up.
If you get a chance, check out Cage's Color of Space. It's actually a really good rendition of the text, and it's pretty good.
Has anyone seen Baraka? Somebody recommended it to me recently.
Baraka?
Barak. They told me there's no words. It's just this like very colorful visual film. I think it's like 1996 or 98 or something.
Yeah.
And it's just depicting all these, you know, just images of some like indigenous culture. I don't know. But he said like it's just kind of like a visual experience.
Has anyone ever seen Koyaanisqatsi?
You?
I think it's a Native American word, and I don't know what group means world out of balance, but this soundtrack is by Nicholas, or by Cage, not Nicholas Cage, by
I introduced Cage. Sorry, I planted that.
no, not Cage. What's the guy that or maybe it is with the music's real repetitive. One of his pieces was like, I've forgotten, like called like 932 or something. It's just he just sits at the piano in silence.
It's John Cage, right?
John Cage, yeah. Yeah, so John Cage wrote the soundtrack to Koyaanisqatsi, and it's this just it just the music evolves very slowly, and there are no words, there are no actors. It is just image after image after image of, you know, this kind of counterposing natural landscapes to the city. So you do not want to watch that movie though late at night when you're really relaxed and have had a couple of shots, because it'll put you right to sleep.
I thought Baraka was okay, maybe I'm totally wrong, but I think there's a trinity of these movies, and Baraka I think is the first, and then
Yeah, I did see that there's a second one.
and then I don't know, I'd say the one that Never just described I think is the second or third one.
Oh, really? Oh,
I
I
think
didn't
they're made
realize
by the
that.
same people, although I might be wrong about that.
That makes sense.
All right.
Although I've never seen either one, but they've been on my list for a long time.
Yeah, I might watch Baraka this weekend.
Take care, gentlemen. Always a pleasure.
Be safe.
Okay,
we should
so
watch the Holy
we need to
Mountain.
have a conversation offline, I guess, about summer stuff, but
Has there been
You
any
guys-
discussion on that?
what's that?
Are we starting fresh with that discussion? Has there been any talk?
Not really. You know, people have thrown out a few ideas, but that's about as far as it's gotten. People have stated a few ideas. I mean, since we haven't really come to, I'm just wondering if maybe we're gonna have to do the thing where, you know, where people suggest something and then like, you know, one or two titles each, and then we have a vote maybe. So, and also for the literature seminar, maybe. What's that?
Spinoza.
I would
I'd be
love
okay
to-
with Spinoza.
Does that need to read
Okay,
it
Spinoza it
anyway?
is. No, I'm joking.
I gave two at the beginning. Guy Hockheim and Heidegger. Oh, Spinoza. Okay.
Which Hochheim do you want to
I
read?
wanted to read Homosexual Desire because it looked like it was a really good text. And I've heard good things about it.
Horkheimer?
Am I saying the name wrong? Guy
Oh, I don't
Hockheim?
know. Oh, Gurkheimer, sorry.
Is he French?
Yes, French
We
and
just
essentialist
did our
political
French-
sexual identity.
We just did our French thing.
Oh,
Well,
come on.
that's
If we're
pretty
doing this by
fun.
continental region.
Yeah, we need some Dutch Jewish people. Yeah.
Thanks, Chase.
Philosophy.
That's
That
obviously
really
the next-
narrows it
That's
down.
obviously the next in the progression,
I
right?
wonder who we'll pick.
Yeah, I wonder who that is.
Jewish Dutch people with long hair. Yeah.
Yeah. But they but they have to have been
Brian
expelled
Lanza.
from the Jewish community.
I also
Yes,
want
yeah.
Brian
You see
Lanza.
God everywhere. Wonder who that
In
is. Chase.
17th century. We haven't done anything from the 17th century, have we?
Well, Spinoza's right
Coincidence?
now,
Yeah.
like my starting point. I feel like that's just a foundation I wanna set. That's my interest. Like, if y'all propose the book that, you know, if this community wasn't alive, I would be reading Spinoza. I'll just say that. So that's my excitement for Spinoza.
Sounds
Okay.
good.
To be
Well,
discussed.
Let's
We
see.
don't discuss it.
I'll probably put something on Discord about voting and we can figure it out. So.
Commit request.
Thank you very much, boss.
Appreciate you. Thank you, Nimitz. Gentlemen, bye.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.